Well, good morning, everyone. On behalf of the Office of Higher Education and Commissioner Dennis Olson, I'd like to welcome you to the OHE Public Engagement Calls. My name is Marcio Thompson. I am the External Relations Manager here with the Office of Higher Education and its Get Ready program. Briefly, the purpose of this call is for the Office of Higher Education to engage with diverse communities in an effort to identify barriers and post-secondary education. We would like to partner or collaborate with communities to provide equitable access to information and advice that leads to the pursuit of a post-secondary degree or certificate for all Minnesotans. This call today is the second edition of a discussion that we started last week around equity in education. This call is primarily has a student focus. We have several panelists today that are students, and I'll introduce all the panelists now. With us today, panelists that we have with us today are Dr. Clyde Pickett, who is the Chief Diversity Officer for Minnesota State, Derek Francis, who is the Manager of Counseling Services for the Minneapolis Public School District, Nadine, Bartolo, who's pursuing a Bachelor's of Arts in Math from Metro State. I have Maria Canar, who has a Bachelor's in Spanish Studies and Pre-Dentistry and from the University of Minnesota, and she plans to apply to dental school in the fall. Aaronica Jackson, also a student, will be graduating from Metro State in August of 2020 with a Bachelor's in Individualized Studies. And Demetria is our final student panelist, and she has a master's degree in education and is currently pursuing a Ph.D. in educational policy and leadership from the University of Minnesota. So I want to welcome all our panelists today, as well as welcome all our attendees, and thank you guys for taking the time to jump on the call with us today. I will ask the panelists just a few housekeeping things, or just one housekeeping thing. Just make sure that you introduce yourself before you speak, so that all the attendees know whose voice they're hearing at that time. As I said before, this is a student-focused call. One of the things I'd like to share with you is a little information about the educational attainment goal that was set back in 2015. So the Minnesota legislature enacted a state post-secondary education attainment goal back in 2015 that said that 70% of all Minnesota adults between the age of 25 and 44 will attain a post-secondary certificate or degree by the year 2025. With that said, one of the first questions for our students is, after hearing that statute, share your personal experience within higher education regarding the support provided for Black, Indigenous, and people of color in effort towards that goal, and what recommendations would you have on higher education and how it can improve retention and graduation rates for those of us in the BIPOC community? Anyone can start.
Hi, this is Aaronica. I would say there needs to be more of a focus on getting out the information for support. I was in TRIO support services while I was obtaining my degree, but I had no idea what TRIO was until I was maybe 2 years in to school, and had already messed up a couple times. So I think that once the word starts to get out about the support that are there to support us, then I think it's easy. So yeah.
Hey, this is Derek Francis, Manager of Counseling Services and I wanted to just share just some feedback that I've received from students and seen, but then also my own experience doing my undergrad and grad school here in Minnesota. I think to really give that support for students of color, schools have to be honest and direct about how they're doing that work. You have to be intentional about just knowing what it's like being a person of color going to college in Minnesota. Our schools are predominantly white, not saying that it's not a positive thing to go to a predominantly white institution, but I think you have to be mindful of what it's like for our students being in a new college environment, away from home for some students, and oftentimes one of the few on campus or the few in the dorms. So being aware of just that transition, but providing engagement for our students from underrepresented populations, making sure you're reflecting that in your staff. So having staff of color that are there building relationships with students and having it, if it's in your school's vision and mission to do equity work, making sure that you're staying to it. So have policies for when issues happen around race so that students feel comfortable and welcomed and supported at the school, not just another number, but they're also feeling welcomed, valued, and in leadership positions within the school. So I think that's one step that that institutions can start to do to help students from underrepresented populations feel more connected and supported on campus.
And I wanted to weigh in as well. I'm sorry, please go ahead.
Oh, hi, it's Demetria. I was going to say I agree as well as the speaker previous that schools do have to be honest. I did all my education at the U of M, and I'm out of state. And what I really felt like was a plus for the U of M is that when I got into the school and got accepted, they actually had students of color and other people in the admissions who were BIPOC or ADOS, or American Descendants of Slaves, who contacted me and told me about certain resources that they had that was available. One of them was MK, they had the BSU and stuff like that. And then MK had a week where all the students of the BIPOC community were able to come a week before that freshman week and just be amongst our small population. Other students who are in undergrad were our link crew leaders, giving us tours, having conversations, doing team building, all that stuff, making us comfortable before that official week of that freshman week where everybody comes. That's important, but also throughout the school year, just accountability. It was a lot of things that certain students did that made our campus unsafe for the BIPOC community, and our president was very passive about it. A lot of things like them spraying build the wall, and our president had a chance to speak on it, and he said that's their freedom of speech, and that's hate speech. So things like that. It's not enough to just put our picture on your pamphlet. You have one black person, one Somali girl, you have one person who's Native American, and two white students, and say, oh, we have diversity. That's not okay. It goes throughout the whole school year. Once you get us there, you should have faculty and staff that look like us, who have been where we have been, so that we have people that we can count on and go to make it safe and make us comfortable in that space.
Hi, my name is Maria Canar, and I would love to share my experience with this regarding this question about higher education. I am a student of color. I am Latina, and I'm also a single parent. And for me, I feel like the whole system is already complicated, and sometimes being a single parent is really hard to figure it out. And my recommendation is if the system was more simpler and actually more comprehensive for people, and, you know, just like the county caseworker that some people have, if there's something that can be available for students of color in the higher education system that can help us guide and figure out, you know, those details, you know, that would help us invest less or energy in trying to find resources or trying to apply for grants and things like that, or make it complicated, when, you know, having someone else that can help us with that work, and it can help us put our energy in actually in school, and it will keep us there. It will not only keep students of color, but also like single parents like me. As an example, at the U of M, I had an advisor, and that focused on my major, and every semester she would check with me with the courses that we're taking, so it kind of helped me stay on track, and that was the academic part. But if we would have something like that with the higher education, that we can get that support, it will make a big difference. And as for me, I feel the post-secondary grant has to change to help parents and single parents with daycare, and it needs to be more flexible. College institutions should allow post-secondary to be the post-secondary grant to be combined with other grants, and or that at least it can cover the 16 weeks of daycare for our kids. So that's my feedback on that.
Thank you, Nadine. Sorry, thank you, Maria.
Yep.
I also wanted to respond just a bit to what we're hearing from our students in some important thematic areas. The importance of organizations, particularly as we think about colleges and universities, being student-focused and student-ready organizations, meaning they take the opportunity to check in, to apply the appropriate triage to understand their students' needs. I think when we think about holistic academic support and holistic student support, it means that you have the appropriate culturally responsive training mechanisms in place to think about those experiences. As our panelists, and certainly I extend thanks to the panelists for allowing me to spend some time and join you, our students' experiences specifically. If you are a first-generation student, if you're a student who is also a parent, how do institutions think intentionally about providing the appropriate support that you need? So that's a big part of this conversation. The other part of the discussion, and our colleague earlier shared this information, is the importance of us thinking about the impact of policy. If we're not reviewing policy and thinking about how policy has to shift and change to meet the needs of students, particularly as we think about holistic support and support to get students to the finish line, then we're missing the key opportunity. It's not enough for us to have policies in place without reviewing them in a culturally responsive way so that they meet the needs of our students. The other check-in point, I think, is orientation, and this was shared earlier, how we, in the orientation process, are doing our due diligence to prepare our students for the available support services that are in place. Aaronica referenced this earlier, and I appreciated her bringing this to the attention. As we think about TRIO and other support mechanisms, while they might be helpful and impactful, if we're not sharing them with all students when they acclimate or come to us, then we're spinning our wheels. We have to provide ample space and opportunity to share the available opportunities for support. So I wanted to make sure that I brought that forward.
Thanks so much, Dr. Pickett. Did anyone else want to weigh in on this question? Did we hear from all the students?
This is Nadine. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. You know, I agree with, I think Maria was the one that spoke, the panelist before me, and I completely agree with her. I'm not a single parent, but I've had several advisors who have checked in on me on a regular basis, and honestly having that support and just knowing that someone cares and is there checking in on me has really made an impact in school. And, you know, if it wasn't for them, I wouldn't know of a lot of resources that are around. I mean, you get emails, but sometimes, like someone else mentions, just the language in which is written, I don't always understand, and just knowing that I can go to someone to explain things. For example, like the FAFSA, you get these letters saying you need this and this, and sometimes I just don't understand what they're asking me for, and just having that advisor that she can explain what exactly is needed. I'm like, wow, this was really simple. I just didn't understand the language in which it was written.
And that type of support is huge. So thanks for sharing that. As BIPOC students, I've heard a lot of things that you guys in terms of the feedback. One of the things I just wanted to add some context to, I believe it was Maria that said something about providing, extending funding to provide childcare for those student parents. Nadine, not Nadine, I'm sorry. Maria, I wanted you to know that actually the Office of Higher Education does have a child care grant that allows student parents to apply for that grant to help support them paying for child care during the time that they're pursuing their degree. So we'll make sure that when we send out the follow-up email to this panel, that information is provided in that follow-up email, so not only you but other students who are parents as well have an opportunity to use that as a resource as they continue to pursue post-secondary education in the state of Minnesota. So thank you guys for sharing on that. One other thing we just wanted to talk about, excuse me, or another question that we had today, just thinking about how things are shifting and changing in terms of on campus to the digital divide. And one of the questions we wanted to ask students is, how do you feel to have the social aspect of college, which includes the networking and relationship building, and how you can benefit from that in the future? How do you feel about that being taken away at this time?
Well, I can start. This is Maria Canar again, and regarding the social aspect, I graduated this spring from the U of M, and one of the things that my social aspect was attending the pre-dental club. It was something that I'm interested in dentistry, and it was one of the things that I was able to attend to be more informed, to there was a couple of dentists that would come and talk about their experiences and ways to pay for school. So it was a very helpful resource to have, and not to have it anymore because of COVID. It turned me apart a little bit. And as you know, as a single parent, there's so many things, and there's so many. I have limitations on what social aspect you other people can be referring to, you know. So that's my experience.
I think just being mindful when we're thinking about the time we're in, just socially being able to connect. I think you have to look at also for our students, because I'm connected to some of my students who graduated. The first class that I worked with, they're graduating college this year. And especially for students from underrepresented populations, if they're first generation and they're doing their first go round and trying to break into the professional world, make professional connections, interviews, networking, we have to be mindful, especially those who work in career centers or in higher ed or even employment agencies, to reach out and be proactive to recruit and support the students that are of color to get positions, to apply for internships, apply for jobs, because you have to be aware of what patterns are already set. Our white and more affluent students, they have that generational backing. They have family members who have probably been at the University of Minnesota or other schools in their lineage, and they have access to connections and resources that many of our students of color have not been able to accumulate generationally. So we have to put extra focus to our students of color that are graduating to make sure they feel they're having a relationship and being guided into applying and breaking down those barriers, because you got to imagine also there's already barriers for students and people of color when they're applying for employment. And so we don't want those to be compounded during distance learning. So I think it's really important that a lot of this weight goes on college preparation, being mindful and aware of your students from underrepresented populations who are struggling, who may not even have computer access, who need that extra support. You can't just rely on your TRIO programs. It has to be on that college to have those intentional interventions ready for their students of color. You can't just bring them on to campus and tote around that you have these students and your population is getting more diverse. You have to put out there intentional strategies to support and understand where these students are coming from, the environments they are from, and be aware of the lack of potentially having the connections that some of their white students have. So that's how you close those gaps.
Hi, this is Aaronica. I think for me in the transition to now everything being digital, at first it was really rough. At Metro, when you originally sign up, it's supposed to be accessible for the folks that aren't on campus or can't get to campus. And so you're supposed to be able to go in and set up your meetings virtual. But once you kind of apply and get in and get your advisor, it's really based on the advisor that you have. And so a lot of them are like, nope, just come in, and sit down with us and we'll go through your plan. But when that wasn't an option anymore, it was like little to no contact unless you specifically were a part of a support group before that. So for my academic advisor, she didn't contact me about anything once we couldn't go back after spring break. So for me, that was hard because I'm one of those send an email every week just to check in to see where I am and to make sure everything is on track. So in that regard, I think with this new shift and not knowing when we're going to be done with it, there has to be a little bit more time and intention put into how we're doing things now and the outreach that we're doing now. Otherwise, the retention rate just isn't going to be there. So.
Aaronica, I appreciate your comments. I want to weigh in just a bit. As we think about this, we're in uncharted territory. I remind us to think that the pandemic just shifted upon us. And as we think about the infrastructure, certainly institutions and organizations are trying to respond to the needs of students. And I think those that will be most successful are those who will think intentionally and do their due diligence, as you point out, to provide appropriate outreach to students. Certainly all organizations are suffering with their own gaps in terms of competency for their faculty and for other frontline supporters who also don't have the skills that are required to provide at least the online support. I think organizations that have a responsibility to meet the needs of students, and those who will meet the needs of our students during this time will be those that are intentional, that put time, effort, and appropriate attention into not only scaling up the support for students, which I think that's critical. I think they have to put appropriate attention on the digital divide and thinking about how we can provide access to technology to our students, but also to the individuals charged with providing frontline support. So if you don't have, for instance, access to the same technology for those individuals who are also making those outreach endeavors, you're going to be behind. So I think we've got an opportunity to continue to push forward, and this is where we need help from the Office of Higher Education in thinking about what are the appropriate resources needed from a higher education perspective to put in place the support for those institutions who might not have the same level of resources or another. So, as an equity and inclusion practitioner and someone who's done this work for a long time, we have to be honest with ourselves and say that some organizations have more resources than others. So that's when we have to think about collaboration across different higher education entities, collaboration and partnership with community-based organizations, and real intentional outreach to get the resources that we need to respond to those things that you talked about, because no organization should be in a place where they don't have enough individuals in place to do the outreach and engagement for the students. Those are things that we've got to work on, and that's a broader education conversation.
Thanks so much, Dr. Pickett, for that insight. Just wanted to, does anybody else want to respond to that? Okay, well, if no one else, I just want to kind of get at the heart of that question. Dr. Pickett, you talked about the infrastructure that had to make well, the infrastructure is currently, as it currently sits, and then having to make a shift due to COVID-19, and how not only the system and the infrastructure itself had to make a change, the students also had to look at what they needed, and that voice may not have been part of that conversation, and not being part of that conversation may have made the structure or the system shift in a way that didn't actually really meet the needs of the students. So I'd like to hear from the students, like, what are some of the barriers that you've seen in distance learning, and what are some of the things that you think that you need to accommodate, or services that you could use to accommodate for this shift in distance learning that schools could be providing?
Hey, it's Demetria. I would say some of the challenges that Okay, thank you. Sorry. I just feel as though some of the barriers, at least for me, was like the Wi-Fi and just device. We don't have, if we're going to do distance learning, it becomes a technology thing now. And a lot of people cannot afford, a computer or an iPad. I know for me, especially during undergrad, I literally relied on the library, and I relied on MK. They had a library too, and that gave me the free computer and the free printing, and I didn't have to worry about Wi-Fi. But now with schools being out and libraries, actual physical public libraries not being in session either, that causes a barrier of how do I find a way to access not only my classes, but a device for homework as well. So I feel as though schools will have to provide, some hotspots or some free Wi-Fi codes or some way to provide for that. I don't know how they would go about giving a device to each student. I know for teaching in elementary, we gave a device. For ICO school districts, we gave a device per family. Higher ed is completely different, but I feel as though it should be a grant or something that kids can do a form, like, oh, do you have this specific need, fill out this form, and then, find a way to get them a device, or do some open lab times of social distancing so that people can come in and try to get some work done, because otherwise that disparity and that inequality with just having access to internet or a device is going to cause a lot of people who are first gen, who are low income, to pretty much drop out. And not because they don't have the ability to do the work, they don't have the tools to do the work. So, yeah.
Thank you.
This is Aaronica.
Go ahead.
That was the biggest thing, the Wi-Fi. The Wi-Fi was the biggest thing for us, especially our building provides Wi-Fi because this is a single moms in school program. But now we went from maybe a couple people here and there using the Wi-Fi to 40 households in one place using this Wi-Fi. And so everything on Zoom, everything on Teams would just crash the entire system. And so I think that has to be looked into a little bit more. When I did work in the public school system, if students didn't have access to internet, we were able to give a hotspot for the family. That was something that was available. But I think when, like, moving forward, that has to be something that is taken into account, is the technology. Like, one of my professors didn't even have a computer. Like, it just, it's like, there's got to be a little bit more put into some of this.
I think your points resonate, Aaronica, once again. We assume that because many of us are using technology that others embrace it as well. We've got a number of our colleagues who are involved with frontline instruction who have not as quickly embraced the delivery of instruction online. So there are a couple of factors that are underneath this conversation about the digital divide. Part of this conversation is about access to Wi-Fi and devices, and that's a reality. It brings to mind the importance of us thinking about the urban versus rural divide as well. So as we're thinking about these conversations about communities, particularly in greater Minnesota, who lack the infrastructure to have high-speed internet, that's another part of the conversation as well. So that's a big discussion. Also, how do we equip not only our students to use technology, but as you talk about, the professors, instructors, and teachers who use this as well. Some of our colleagues aren't as skilled or have not been provided the appropriate training, and in real time we're trying to make this response and respond to an educational challenge. So we've got a lot of work to do. The other part, as we think about accessibility and thinking about how we scale up support for all different learner types, is a part of the conversation as well. So it's not enough just to hand someone a laptop or to give them internet access. There are broader conversations as we think about, and we've talked about this on the call earlier, that frontline support and the instruction that's needed to support their needs and their learning style. So that's another part of the conversation too.
Hi, this is Maria again, and I would like to share my experience. And I feel that the college student model that is expected is that, you know, we have a good internet, we have a good computer to work on, and that no one is bothering us, and we have this quiet time. But as a single parent with kids at home, that's not what happened. That's not what happened at my place. So I feel that when institutions base their support in poverty guidelines to identify low-income households, I feel that's where the problem begins. So if I make $200 more than the poverty guideline, and I'm barely meeting my basic needs, how can I be expected to afford distance learning? You know, as a single parent, I had to share my computer with my 8-year-old for her school. She even had more homework than I did. So I know we're all going through hard times right now, but I feel like this is a great time to advocate for changes in the poverty guidelines, you know, and maybe the internet should be a public utility. It should be available to everyone, and prices could be regulated. You know, we all need a computer, even kids, to get into learning. And the way that the system is set up, for example, my daughter in her school, K through 4th, they don't get an iPad. They don't get iPads. They don't get computers. Only 5th graders up, they get an iPad to work at home, even if they're physically in school. So she, as a 2nd grader, was left out. She couldn't get an iPad or a computer. So for me, it was very challenging because we only had one computer and we had to share, and the internet was really, really, really bad. So that made it very challenging for me. And my institution required me to keep learning. So how can we do something like that when the internet is crashing, when the audio is not working, and she needs to listen to a story, or she needs to connect with her teacher, or when I need to be in a Zoom meeting with my professor? So, you know, this is an individual story, and I'm pretty sure everybody else has their own story too, you know, in different ways. So that was one of my barriers, and also having, you know, being a parent, being a single parent, having kids around with me and trying to study and trying to help the 8-year-old stay focused. So that's my input.
Hi, this is Nadine. My biggest struggle was finding a place to do my own work and like do my own Zoom meetings with the students I work with and or my professors. I think that some people can relate. I live with my parents and my family, my husband and kids live here as well. And I think just having this pace where I could do my homework was very hard. Like oftentimes I would have to be like in my bathroom taking Zoom calls with my professor because there was nowhere else to go. The library was closed or any other space when the shutdown happened was not available. And then like people said, more people were using Wi-Fi at home. My kids had to use it and other family members as well. And just there were times where I had to ask them, please, like, can I take the Zoom call quick, and then the internet's all yours. So I can relate to many of other people in the panel, but my biggest struggle was finding a place where I could do my work because my kids were with me all the time, and it was difficult to be in a meeting and focus 100% while I had kids also with me and muting and like not sharing my screen, and I guess there was just also time management. Everything was from home, and I just had a difficult time being able to manage everything when I was at home when everything started.
Hi, this is Maria again. Sorry, I just wanted to give a positive thing back regarding to all of this. Although my experience with online was lousy and, you know, with kids around and everything else, and internet crashing and here and there, and poor quality of internet, I do want to say that and not many people know this, but I was full-time. I was taking science courses, and I got a 4.0 GPA this semester, and I was able to take my kid to pass her until 3rd grade. So we did it. So it worked.
Congratulations. That's commendable under the circumstances. So just want to acknowledge that. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah.
So just listening to all the feedback, it seems like, and one of the reasons we're hosting these calls is to really give voice to the BIPOC population and talk about some of the things that they're being affected by. And it seems like, from what I'm hearing, not to just kind of sum it all up, but it seems like some of the transition when things were transitioned to distance learning, it seems like the perspective of the transition was done from a majority culture perspective and not taking into account, you know, all the barriers that were already in place for students of color, and then seeing those as exacerbated by the current situations, but to not know that, you know, every situation was not ideal. Like everyone didn't have a space at home to do homework. Everyone didn't have internet at their homes. Everybody didn't have a device. So in making that turn, we've seen that maybe it wasn't done with, maybe it wasn't done with the most equitable lens in terms of providing supports for students who didn't have those things that people in the majority might have. So, and hearing that, I heard something earlier about outreach, and I want to just ask, you know, what is the most effective means or mechanisms for outreach for students, especially during this time? And, you know, what feedback would you give to institutions on how to effectively communicate with students during the time that we're transitioning from, you know, on-campus learning to distance learning, especially as we look towards the fall?
Hi, this is Nadine. I think that like one-on-one, just like advisors connecting one-on-one or teachers connecting one-on-one with each student instead of like sending a mass email is very effective, or like call in. I had a professor in the spring semester, call me when everything started. And he called me twice, actually, at the beginning, at the end. And just knowing that the professor reached out to me personally to make sure that I understood what was going on, the resources available, was very meaningful to me, just because I knew, like, hey, this professor is, like, taking time to connect with each and every one of us, instead of just, like, saying it all in, like, one of our Zoom meetings or, like, sending a big email. Just knowing that someone is connecting with you one-on-one, even if it's just the technology, I think is very meaningful, and more people will be more willing to engage with that and ask questions.
This is Aaronica. I guess when you are talking about outreach, are you talking about when you're already within the institution or coming into college?
We're kind of looking at both.
Okay. So I would say, I mean, at this point, to be equitable, you kind of have to scrap the idea that everybody has access to the same technology that you have, right? So we kind of have to dial it back and get into pre-internet and start making the phone calls. The nice thing that, well, the thing that I liked about Zoom and Teams is that if you don't have access to something with a camera, then you could call in. And so making sure that people know that they can just call in and hear the same information. If the Wi-Fi is bad, doing the call-in, but maybe just sending the PowerPoint. And so I think that that's, even when we were doing our Zoom classroom, that's the thing that was missing. Everybody would be on the Zoom call and the professor would be going through a PowerPoint, but if my internet went down, now I missed the PowerPoint. So just being mindful about those things, especially because all of them don't use D2L. So now we're at a point where individual emails do have to be sent out. It can't just be a blanket.
Thanks for sharing that. This is Derek Francis. And I think as we're doing this transition with distance learning, I think first, a lot of the people that are working higher ed, especially professors or support staff, have to recognize the privilege that they have. I think a lot of the professors and support staff are predominantly white, affluent people who cannot relate to what it's like to not have internet. They can't relate to what it's like to be first generation or to need additional support. So I say even before the students get to college, some of that work is on the school, the school counselors, to make sure. Right now, this is probably the hardest time to be a high school senior and transition. So school counselors, especially if you're first generation, your family hasn't had that repetition or patterns of people going to post-secondary, school counselors right now throughout Minnesota, you have to be prioritizing intentionally to connect with your students from underrepresented populations so that they get the right kind of support. Summer melt happens every year where we have students who were planning to go to college in the fall, or students even returning, and they end up not returning to college. This year, more than ever, many students are going to have an excuse, a reason to delay enrolling into post-secondary. If educators, professors, admissions, school counselors can be mindful of this and do that calling right away, connect with those students and families, encourage them, say, hey, you know what, I know we're in the middle of a pandemic. We know that there's a major race incident in town and it's impacting you. The trauma is real. How can we make sure that you stay persistent in your post-secondary goal? You're the first in your family, good. You're going to be the first in your family to graduate from here. Those are the types of mindsets we have to have in our predominantly white colleges and universities. Students know which campuses are more comfortable for them. High school kids know. I don't have to tell them. I throw out a college name, they'll be like, no, that's not for me. I don't know if I can go there. Why? You know why, Mr. Francis. So if your campus already has that type of reputation, you need to be mindful. How are you going to support students from underrepresented populations to feel like you have their back? You want to see them graduate. You're going to call and say, I know you're the first in your family. Let me make sure you know you're coming back in the fall. Make sure you're checking your email. Make sure you're ready for the books you need to order. That's the kind of support that's needed beginning in high school and, goodness, elementary, but then you're picking it up in college. So I really feel that it's really on the staff. Students are dying to go to post-secondary, and we need to make sure we're preparing them and guiding them along the way for making these huge decisions, and it's going to impact our state. These are the future people who are going to be looking for careers and jobs, and we want to make sure that we close that gap in employment, and this is one of the ways that we can do it through our higher education programs, really taking an interest in our students from underrepresented populations.
Mr. Francis, I appreciate your comments. I want to weigh in just a bit. I concur that it's an all hands-on-deck approach to meet the needs of students. And certainly, I would offer that Minnesota State institutions are positioned well to respond to the needs of our students. And I will say this, that a number of our institutions are minority-serving institutions or diverse student-serving institutions as we think about our community and technical colleges. Given that, we also have to think about the differences in our faculty and the faculty who make up those institutions. A number of our community and technical colleges, as well as some of our universities, have a number of community or adjunct faculty who are not affluent and who come from the same backgrounds as a number of our first-generation students. So we have to be mindful of the compositional diversity that also makes up the faculty and understand that some of those faculty respond and understand the needs of our students and are positioned to provide support, but also themselves need resources and support to move this work forward. So we have to think intentionally about the diverse representation, certainly in our students, but also the compositional diversity of our organizations that meet the needs of the learners all across the state. So I wanted to make sure that I offered that.
Thank you so much for offering that, Clyde. And Derek, I think that most people on the call may share your perspective in terms of, you know, the system or our educators or our college staff looking at it differently and not just from their lens and taking the opportunity to step outside of what's traditional or what has been traditional as the way college has been administered, and look at how they can use their influence and their tools to ensure that all students have an opportunity to take part in post-secondary education and not only take part in it, but be successful in it. And I think that's the most important thing when you think about students stepping into that space. One of the things that you guys have been talking about, and Clyde, you mentioned it very eloquently, the digital divide. And I think that has been definitely exacerbated by the pandemic itself. Not only from the digital perspective, but also from the way instruction is done. So, you know, I don't think that every institution has teachers that are adept with the methodology of delivering coursework in an, you know, non-classroom or a social distancing environment. So not only do staff have to make the transition and notice that they don't have the ability to successfully impart the wisdom they're to impart with students from the digital environment, because they have to transition and to get skilled up, but students are also having to make that transition as well. Seeing that we have that intersection, what are some things that we can proactively and intentionally do to make sure that, one, on the institution side, that staff are being prepared to be able to do this work in a different way, and then what other things do you do on the student side intentionally focused towards students to ensure that they are having what they need in order to be successful in the digital divide? I know you kind of spoke to that a little bit earlier, but I just wanted to hit on some points of what are those specific things that you see or that institution see that are definite, drop dead needs right now? I know someone mentioned technology, but there are also a social and emotional aspect to this. So I just kind of want to come back to that and hear some of those. What are those key points that you see from your position in leadership, Clyde?
Well, I think there are a couple. I think certainly let's be clear. The gaps existed before the COVID-19 pandemic. It's just further illuminating where we are and the necessity to take action, particularly as we think about access to technology and accessibility conversations for diverse learners. That's been front and center for many of us who have advocated for and challenged organizations and systems to think about the importance of scaling up our needs in terms of use of technology and, to be quite honest, the skills and developing of the appropriate delivery of learning to support the needs of those learners. So I think an ongoing commitment in the conversation about how we develop a mechanism to support our students is a big part of the conversation. We've talked at length about, well, not at length, but limitedly about the importance of check-in. You have to normalize academic check-in points for your students, to normalize the opportunity to have culturally responsive orientation processes in place to make sure that you have appropriate triage and that you're sharing the resources that are available at the institution and the organization. It's a big part of the conversation. Ongoing assessment of your learning outcomes and ongoing assessment of where you are in terms of your opportunity gaps. Certainly that's a big conversation, and data is a central part of this discussion. How we're monitoring the experiences of our students and how we're using data to motivate us to make better decisions to meet the needs of our students. And part of this conversation is about data democratization, how we're sharing that information. So certainly this is a work in progress, but it's work that for most organizations, it already started, but it further exacerbates and exposes some of those gaps in terms of where we are with the appropriate tools to meet the needs of learners.
Derek.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And I would say, as I'm thinking about this, there's certain parts of it I'm glad you brought up too, that these gaps between students of color and our white students definitely were present prior to COVID. And not only that, our gaps in our educators' ability to support and be advocates for students from underrepresented populations, that was there prior to. So I think every institution, whether you're a high school, middle school, elementary school, college, I think the first thing is doing that real internal look at your institution and yourself and doing the bias training. There's a lot of bias and microaggression and to be honest, racist practices going on in education in Minnesota. And that is directly impacting how students are being successful. Minnesota in schools, whether it's high school, middle school, elementary, or college, students have been experiencing discrimination from their own staff in the school, the same people that are supposed to support students. And it's not always the outright things that people are doing. I think sometimes just being mindful of who's being disciplined more at your schools, who's not being offered chances to be in those higher level classes to even be in a position to have the opportunity to go to a post-secondary institution. Who's not having that authentic relationship with their teacher or their counselor about their future, and which counselors are not giving appropriate matching for students for their post-secondary. That's why training's needed. Our schools have been doing this for years. We have some of the biggest gaps in the country, and to be honest, a lot of it comes down to how are we changing these practices and policies that are getting in the way of supporting students. Next, I'm so glad that was brought up about what campus can do, because the thing is, people on campus, the staff on campus, are huge in building the culture and the environment. Looking at the time we're in right now, we're in 2020. We're in the midst of a pandemic. We just had a major racial incident happen in our country, and we're in an election year. So if you're at a campus right now and you've had race incidents in the past, and even if you haven't, it's so important that you're preparing your campus to have conversations around race, bias, privilege, because students coming in, whether it's virtually or it's in person, are going to be aware of these things. And that topic is going to keep coming up throughout the rest of this year and this school year. So make it comfortable to talk about race. It's part of our students of color identity. Put it out there. If you've been nervous to talk about it or shied away from conversations, I think it's really important that you make it a part of your institution, your team that you're working with. Make it a part of the habit that you do. Look at the data. Goodness, who's not achieving as well as other groups? How long has that been going on? And if you don't call out those things, call out those current practices that are leading to gaps, then you're perpetuating it. So I really feel that each department, each team has to look at themselves and say, do we really want to get this work done? Are we really going to get the training that we need? Because it's needed. And I think the situations that came about over the past 3 months really shine a magnifying glass on the issues that are key to contributing to the racial gaps that we see in education.
This is Aaronica. I would also add to that that it can't just be the student organizations of color putting that out there, right? It needs to come from the institution.
I agree with both of those points, and Derek, you threw a lot at us. And one of the things I think that's important for us to understand, the organizations that will survive and thrive in the future are those that will have an anti-racism ethos embedded in the leadership philosophy of the organization. I truly believe that if you're not using a racialized lens to examine the policies and procedures of your organization, you can't move this work forward. And that's a critical component of this work as we think about the disparities in discipline, the disparities in terms of access to the support mechanisms that are in place to meet the needs of our learners, the support mechanisms to look at how we hire and retain employees of diverse backgrounds and BIPOC people. Those organizations that have an anti-racist ethos, those organizations that prioritize an inclusive sense of belonging, are those organizations that not only will attract those students, but also will graduate those students and will be the most productive in closing opportunity gaps. And to your point, Aaronica, will be the points that support those student organizations so that they don't have to be the lone voices in advocating and moving this work forward. We know that historically in this country, that student activism has been essential in every major movement that's ever happened. Certainly, I expect that to continue, but the organizations will meet the needs and rise to meeting those students where they are and respond to challenging their faculty, their staff, and their administration to undertake the appropriate training and ongoing cultural competency development will be those that will be the most successful and the most impactful in making the change for the future.
So thank you for all those points, Dr. Pickett and Derek. You guys said something earlier about, you mentioned data democratization and the use of data. And as I said before when we started the discussion, that Minnesota had set an attainment goal around some data measurements. And knowing that the attainment goal is 7% of all adults between 25 and 44 having some type of post-secondary certificate or degree by 2025. And that's across all racial categories, so across the BIPOC, 70% as well. When we think of those things, you mentioned about the data, and some of the things that need to be changed. I'd like to hear from students and from yourselves as well, Derek and Clyde. What are some ways that institutions can be held accountable once they review data and they see that students are being impacted by some of the policies and procedures, or by the way that they deliver curriculum or learning, by the way that they apply policies and procedures? How do we hold institutions accountable, like at the student level and at the administration level, for changing the data points that are most important or that are glaring, seeing that, our Native American students and our students of, I would say students of color are the lowest in terms of academic attainment in the state of Minnesota. So how do we start to hold these institutions accountable for the work that they're doing and not retaining these students and graduating these students?
Hi, it's Demetria. I feel like a way that we hold these institutions accountable is using our voice and making it known that this is a problem. Because I feel as though for, like, especially at the U of M, they really don't move unless the students make them move. Like when it becomes a problem for them, like when they constantly hear it and we're constantly calling the president or sending emails or sitting inside Moral Hall, like when we make our presence known as well as our voice about what we want as a community, I feel as though that's when things change and these institutions are held accountable. But I feel like also as students and just as the community, being mindful of the people that when these presidents and these people are put into positions at these institutions, really being mindful of who's running and who gets elected. Because once they get into these positions, if they already have problematic beliefs and didn't really see anything wrong with how the BIPOC communities are being treated in these institutions, they carry that on in their positions. So the first step is really getting the people that's for us in these positions. If we can't and it's already what's done is done, protesting, writing letters, proposing new policies and stuff, constantly like demanding change is what holds them accountable. And I know recently at the U, just with the whole George Floyd thing and the presence of police officers, the presence of police officers at the U of M have always been racial themes. They have always over-policed the Black communities, the Black events, so BSU events and stuff like that. Wherever the presence of BIPOC was, the police so happily, the campus police was so happily there. Versus on Frat Row, where people are openly doing things that they shouldn't be doing, they don't bother them. So it was already an issue with things like that, but after the George Floyd and, students coming together to petition and say, like, we do not feel the need to be over-policed or policed at all, the president heard us, and this is a new president as well, but she heard us and she completely cut the contract with Ph.D. for the U of M. So that was an issue that was already known, but because we weren't demanding the change, nothing changed.
So this is Aaronica. I would even add in like the transparency piece. I had no idea about the graduation, what was it, 75 by 2025?
75, 2025.
Yeah, so I had no idea about that, right? And for me, why is that not on the website? Why is that not posted with a plan that the institutions have to put on the website to say how they're going to get there and what they're going to do? So how do we hold people accountable if we don't know what we're supposed to be holding them accountable for?
That's a word right there.
I'm glad that you shared that too, because I think accountability, that's the main thing that keeps coming to my mind as we're having this conversation. And I think it's important that it's all the way through now. And if I'm just going to be transparent with you all, it has to be with resource and financial accountability. If institutions are saying they want to better support students that are from underrepresented populations, how are you doing that financially? And not only that, how are you valuing and loving and caring for all students of color that come into your campus, not just the ones that are athletes, that you give the utmost amount of resources and support to. So not just the ones that can do something for your sports team, they get tons of support and tons of tutoring and attention and connection to your staff. But do the same thing for the students of color that are on campus that don't play a single sport, the ones that are not in any clubs or organizations. Those are the students who need that type of support and attention, not the ones that already have the privilege to be able to play sports really well. And no diss on athletes. I love sports. I played sports in high school and college. But I'm aware of those gaps, my peers who didn't play sports, who didn't get the same support that I received. So just like they're providing support for those student athletes, provide support for the students that are of color that are not athletes. The money is there. Also, I think it's important to be mindful of holding people accountable as far as when they say these initiatives. Every school says we want to be equity, inclusion, diversity, inclusion, all that jazz. But let's start looking at the data more frequently. See what changed. What things changed to move the needle? What do you have practices in place to talk about your hiring practice? Who you're hiring, who you're not hiring, how you're doing interviews. Also, what policies, because I don't want to just focus on the hiring and getting people of color to these institutions, but also being aware, because I have plenty of colleagues and students who have gone to schools in Minnesota and they leave. Why do they leave? Why are people of color not staying? So be mindful if you're one of these institutions around what is your policy for addressing racism. Being just straight up about it. What's your policy when a race incident happens? I say when, not if, because it does happen, and students of color share that. So what are you doing in response to that? How are you doing that at the leadership level when someone says something or does something? How are you holding places to call people out with love and care and accountability? That's some of the things that need to happen systemically, but then also hearing the students, being mindful of what it feels like to be on campus. And then the part that I see even more is how are institutions reaching out to high schools? I'm here in Minneapolis Public Schools. We have probably the highest concentration of students of color in the state. And you would imagine if your institution says they want to increase their students of color, that they want to get more students of color on campus, that they would be coming through to our district frequently. So now the question is, if they are coming, where are they going and where are they not going? And I know certain schools that certain high schools that certain colleges are not investing in, are not connecting with the students, are not looking at their applications and considering them for admissions into their school. And a lot of these students have the same GPA and can definitely do well in that school with the right support. So I think campuses, even down to admissions, has to be honest about wanting to do this work, wanting to have students of color on campus and support them and see them equally, not special rights, equally as other students.
Just to weigh in with a couple of thoughts, certainly I echo all that's been expressed by the other panelists. As we think about accountability, a critical part of this conversation about accountability, as was shared by Derek, is this conversation about funding and how we think about funding organizations and higher education in general. Those organizations that are most impactful in assisting students get to the finish line for certificates, degrees, should be prioritized as we think about funding, shifting of funding. The other part of that conversation is our investment in organizations. We make a choice to attend certain institutions. If we know those institutions are not supporting the needs of our students specifically, clearly we shouldn't attend those institutions and should bring attention to the fact that they're not meeting the needs of our learners. Part of that conversation is to think about what the data tells us and what's the narrative of data, both in terms of quantitative and qualitative approaches to data. It's not enough for us to say students of color. We have to disaggregate that data and think about the experiences of those different subpopulations that are a part of that conversation, particularly as we think about Black and African American students and understanding that there are different situations associated with the data and that we have to disaggregate. The other part of the conversation as it relates to accountability is how we put into place, as we think about the performance of these leaders, the performance of this faculty that meet the needs of our learners, accountability metrics to look at their commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. If it's not a part of your performance evaluation, then essentially you're not being held accountable to do it. So as we think about boards of trustees, as we think about our work, and we think about the efforts of community-based organizations, we have to call on these organizations to ask them to respond to how they're meeting the needs of our expectations to get to those attainment goals that we've set. So I wanted to make sure that I mentioned that as part of the conversation.
Hi, this is Maria Canar again, and I wanted to give my input about the data that many of us are talking about right now. And my input is that the usage of the data puts everyone in a one shoebox. Blacks, Indigenous, and people of color, we all have stories. We all come from different backgrounds, and labeling, we're cutting off many stories here, you know. And as a Latin American woman, I can tell you that there are students that work to help their low-income parents to support a home while they attend to college full-time. So in my case, as a single parent, I had to battle around the broken system that we have to be able to attend college full-time, being a full-time parent and working part-time. So when we take this data, the average of this data as a solution for everyone, it just really doesn't work, you know, because we're seeing 100 stories out there, and they're unique stories. And then I feel like we need to break it more down. You know, take me as an example. I was already with a disadvantage when I started school. I came to the U.S. when I was 11, and I spoke no English. Right there, there's a disadvantage. My parents had no degrees. My mom had a high school diploma. My dad didn't even graduate high school. So my parents didn't really have the resources to guide me to a higher education. So the more that we break down this data, we will be able to help serve people better, you know, because that's the whole goal of this. One thing that I wanted to throw out there was that in the U.S., less than 10% of Blacks and Hispanics are in dental school. Less than 5% of Hispanics and Blacks practice dentistry. So my goal, I want to be a leader. As a Latina woman, I want to be a role model, and I want to push more people like me, Blacks, students of color, Indigenous, everyone, to let them know that there are opportunities out there, and we're very determined people, and we need to be given that opportunity. More doors need to be open. Yep.
Maria, I appreciate you sharing your story. That data disaggregation piece that you talk about is so critical, so we can think about the experiences of the different learners that are present in our organizations. Part of that conversation is to think about the quantitative data, populations and people matter, but also the narrative data that you speak to. I think it's critical for us to think about those experiences, and I certainly appreciate you sharing your experience. Like a number of our students, I was a first-generation student, also a parent, so making my way through higher education in that same way. And I'm sure that my narrative and the experience that I had can not only be beneficial to the organization and learning more about what they need to do to take steps towards supporting students who are like me, but also as we think about the students who have shared their experiences here, we have a responsibility to learn from their experiences and to make the appropriate investment, whether it's support for childcare, support for technology, expanding internet access, but doing what we need to do. And we can only do that if we get those narrative experiences and we think about quantitative as well as qualitative data and disaggregating that for experience.
Do we have any other voices that want to weigh in on that? We did want to take the opportunity to see if anyone one of the attendees had a question for any of the panelists. There was one question that came in the chat, and it says, how is MinnState providing support for students of color regarding trauma, et cetera? So it says, where I work, we didn't even have a licensed therapist. So, Clyde, are you able to speak to that? How is MinnState providing support for SOC students regarding trauma? And it may be related to the current trauma or just trauma period when you think about the SOC community.
Well, I appreciate that question. I think that each campus is a campus-by-campus basis. From a system perspective, we're strategizing conversations and advancing our work to think about how trauma influences the experiences of all of our students. My own research looking at institutional mechanisms for students of color identifies right off the top that trauma is something that we all bring to the classroom, we all bring to our campuses, and something that has to inform not only our practice, but the response in the shape of policy. So I think that from a policy perspective, we're using that as a way to think about how we educate certainly our staff and administrators, and also to think about how it influences and shapes our curriculum. Now, I'll remind the individual asking this question that context matters, so depending on the institution, I can speak to it more specifically, but I do know that it's a work in progress and that there's no clear-cut answer as the way trauma shapes and informs our experiences changes in an ongoing way. You know, 6 months ago, we weren't having a conversation about this situation with the killing of George Floyd and how now that has influenced certainly the trauma that we have and how it's impacted our community, and the need to provide appropriate triage and response to that incident will now be incorporated in the fabric of all that we do in our system, and more specifically, all we do in higher education and K-12 education as well. So it's an ongoing conversation, and one that I think that needs heightened attention.
I would like to echo Dr. Pickett and just bringing to the forefront the implications for mental health in this moment. I think this is the #1 thing that the ball is being dropped on, and not only that, it's furthering the current gap we already have in access and information and even stigma around mental health. And so just thinking about it, and I'll use Minneapolis as an example because we got to call our own selves out. We need to make sure that we have adequate support for students beginning in elementary school, and especially to even get them to the higher education, just navigating the trauma from life. Not even COVID. Students of color were experiencing trauma before COVID, and those of you who might not be familiar, look up the term racial battle fatigue. It's been studied, it's been researched where students of color in schools, and this study was around college students, how coming in they experience a lot of trauma, a lot of high sensitivity for depression and anxiety when on campus in college as compared to their other colleagues. So being mindful of that fatigue that students are navigating when they come to school, but also under-resourced. In Minneapolis Public Schools, we don't have school counselors even in our elementary schools. None of our elementary schools have school counselors, and we happen to be one of the most diverse districts in the state. But then our counterparts like St. Paul, I applaud them for having counselors in their elementary schools because students need to have, especially students of color, the skills, the proactive strategies for how to navigate these stressors of life. We're not that far removed from segregation and discrimination practices that were legal in our country. And so those things don't go away just because a document's been signed. Students are experiencing those same situations at a micro level through microaggressions, through discrimination on campus. So being aware of that feeling, and then also the identity. Being a person of color in our country takes a toll on you if you don't have the right people talking to you, pouring into you. We have a lot of, and that's part of the gap too, we have a lot of students of color that they just made it to college or just made it to passing, and they need that support to build their confidence and self-worth and validate that they belong on campus. And instances like George Floyd and COVID are setbacks. And so we need to make sure that we have people who know how to respond culturally appropriately to our students from underrepresented population. One size definitely does not fit all. So you have to be aware of your privilege if you've never been in a situation of people of color to experience discrimination, bias on a consistent basis, and that toll that it takes. You need to get trained in that, and we need to have resources available for our students and systems set up to avoid those situations from happening in our schools. That's why it's important that we address this mental health piece. It's so important because also you look at the rate of suicide and depression and anxiety is going up in our families and community of color. So you have to address that because that's what students are coming in with. How do you expect them to learn and be ready to focus when they're dealing with that trauma and these triggers that reoccur to bring it up? And then they're trying to sit next to a peer who doesn't have to navigate these same traumas, but also if they do, they have resources that they know of to get that help. So career centers, counseling centers, be proactive in talking to your students about race. Put it out there. Don't make it awkward. See how they're holding up on campus and how they're identifying on campus and if it's being validated on your campus.
Thanks so much. There are opportunities to be brave, and it doesn't always have to be on the student side, right? So it seems like there's an opportunity for faculty and staff to do that. I did get a question in the chat. It looks like it may be from someone who might be faculty. It says, what are the best ways for faculty to provide the kind of supports that you're talking about without overwhelming students with emails? So it says that they express that they try to connect with students, but they just want to know what's the best way to really support students. So anybody wants to chime in on that?
This is Aaronica. I would say listen. Like start with just listening, and also being at a point where you can listen without being defensive. So if there are certain resources that you know that are in your campus that work, then provide those resources. But the first thing you have to do is listen for what we as students need.
Hey, and this is Derek. To add on, I think listen and validate students if they're sharing something that hurts. I think build that authentic relationship. And I think being open to have humility. Because let's just be honest, a lot of our professors or school staff, if they haven't had authentic connections with people of different backgrounds, we can tell. People of color can tell. And so just be honest and say, you know what, I'm growing and learning and connecting with just growing my cultural knowledge and skills. I have some room to grow. Tell yourself that. Allow yourself that humility. Who cares if you've been a professor for 20 years, if you have your doctorate? You're no expert in other people's experiences of different backgrounds. So have the humility to say, I want to learn. I want to grow. I might make mistakes. I'm going to say sorry. I'm going to reach back out and listen to the students. When they tell me this is what's going on in campus, I'm not going to tell them about how I did a study abroad overseas or did all these things. I'm going to actually listen. We don't need you to share your resume of all the things you've done, all your research. You need to listen with an open heart and be honest about the things you don't understand and say, you know what, I'm now going to be an ally. Not just going to listen, I'm going to support you. I'm going to be there. Don't just give them the words, well, it'll get better. No, it's not. I need help. I need you to hear me. And so many of my students, when they were in college, would share that. They said, I miss having someone hear me and just not just tell me to go get that support. Walk with me there. Stand with me while I'm in that line for financial aid. Help me understand what I'm reading through. Walk through the syllabus with me. So that's the kind of care. You have to ask yourself, educators, do you really want to do this work for everybody? Because it's not going to look the same for the students you've been used to for the past 20 years. There's more people and students of color coming, and you need to adjust your style too. You need to learn how to connect with students from different backgrounds. And it might be a stretch and uncomfortable, but that's good. And it's going to be to your benefit. You'll love the students when you get to know all of them, not just the athletes. Know all of them.
Any other students want to weigh in on that? So Bartolo is asking, how can they support students of color on campus? Like, what does that look like for you from your lens? I think someone's talking, but you may be muted.
Hi, Marcia. This is Kat. There was a clarification question from Derek. Someone asked, what is the trauma called, the defense? Could you clarify that again, Derek?
Yeah, it's called racial battle fatigue.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yep.
And Marcia, there are quite a few other questions. Do you want me to read them, or would you like us to review them and then potentially form future calls based on them?
Some of them are more statements than questions. So maybe
there are new ones.
Okay, can you read the?
Sure. Okay. Okay, so the first one is, can someone speak about intersectionality? What about POC who are also a part of the LGBTYQIA community? And then another one was, given the current state budget deficit of $2.4 billion, how are institutions planning to address the potential cuts to higher education institutional funding? How, if at all, will the budget deficit impact the state grant program and student financial aid?
Okay. That's an important question. I don't know if we can tackle that one in the time that we have left.
I was going to suggest that that be held for a
Yeah, absolutely. That's a full question. I think we kind of addressed it in our previous call as well, Kat, but we'll make sure just to keep that one and maybe send out an answer to that one in the follow-up email. We got about 2 minutes left. I'm sure the support for around intersectionality might be able to be addressed in this time, though.
I think that that's an important consideration as we think about the representation of individuals, particularly our students at all campuses. We have to think about intersectionality and the role that identity plays in not only providing support, but that authentic opportunity to connect that Derek put forward to us. As we think about our experiences and how intersectionality really shapes the way we show up, the way we're present in different kinds of environments, and more importantly, in our exchange and communication, I think to explore cultural competency and to continue to develop our own skills to think about that is a big part of the conversation. Certainly, as we think about the LGBTQIA community and what it means, particularly as we've seen more emphasis put on our Black trans students and Black trans colleagues in different environments, is a big part of the conversation. And organizations that are willing to acknowledge, organizations that are willing to put attention towards, and organizations that are willing to develop the appropriate experiences to allow identity and the presence of identity to be a big part of authentic experience are those organizations that will get it right in terms of thinking about the holistic support needed to meet the needs of students. You know, part of this conversation as we think about what it takes to meet the needs of our learners is allowing them to be their authentic selves in every exchange. In a number of the different opportunities I've had to engage with learners, particularly as we think about intersectionality, I've had a number of students who've identified and said, you know, I can't be my authentic self in this environment. Whether you're Black, whether you are Latinx, I think it's important for organizations to allow space for you to have true authenticity in your identity and to respond and to respect your identity. And more importantly, call on ourselves as leaders to develop our cultural competency to respond to those needs. So intersectionality, to the point that was brought forward, is a critical part in us thinking about true authentic experience. And the nuances of our identity have great depth. A number of our students identified the conversation around where we are in terms of parental status. In the chat earlier, one of the points that I made was this idea that some of us are caretakers for our loved ones, whether they're our parents, whether they're our significant others. A big part of this conversation as we think about intersectionality is how does that shape our ability to support this learning environment and experience? And you know, as organizations that have to respond and meet the needs of inclusivity, we have to take into account all of those forms of identity and intersectionality to truly be an inclusive environment, and one that is equitable in terms of responding to the needs, first and foremost, of our students, and then preparing our colleagues to respond to those needs.
Thank you, Dr. Pickett. We've reached the end time of this discussion. Just want to, make sure to reiterate that the other question that was posed in the chat, whomever presented that question, it will be a question that we'll either follow up with in the email that we send out with the recording of this discussion, or will be held for another opportunity that we have for calls, because we'll be doing these each week, every Wednesday at 10 a.m. So first of all, I just want to thank all the panelists for joining us. So Dr. Pickett, Derek Francis, Nadine Bartolo, Maria Canar, Aaronica Jackson, and Demetria Poe. Thank you guys for the time providing space, and thank you so much for your input in this very important conversation around how you're impacted in post-secondary education from a student perspective. We really appreciate the time you guys have spent with us today. Once again, there will be opportunities for us to meet with and talk to those of you that attended the call each week at 10 a.m. On Wednesdays. We'll be hosting the public engagement calls, and we're looking for your input and taking your advice and pushing our subject matter to answer the questions and burning questions that you have. So thank you again for joining us. We want to make sure that we look at the work that we do seriously through an equitable lens, and understand that intersectionality is part of that, understanding that intersectionality is part of that, and that we need to be mindful of everyone's story. So I appreciate someone bringing that to the forefront. But once again, thank you once again for the opportunity to just engage with you, and that's what these calls are all about. And we hope that you're able to join us again in the next call that we have, which is going to be on July 29th at 10 a.m. and the same call-in number will be used for that. But once again, thank you, panelists, and thank you, attendees, and have a good day.